My son-in-law told the table I was just a handyman who got lucky with a van the night he made partner at his firm. What Brendan didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that for 31 years I had been running covert operations for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. 3 hours after he said it, the director of CSIS called his cell phone personally to ask for my immediate assistance on an active file. The call came in front of 47 guests, including 2 federal ministers and the Chief Justice of Ontario. Brendan thought he was embarrassing a man who fixed leaky faucets. He ended his own career instead. 3 years of letting people think I was a retired tradesman. 3 years of driving my '09 Silverado with the rust along the wheel wells. 3 years of watching my daughter smooth things over, with a look I recognized, the same look her mother used to give me when I'd come home with a story I couldn't tell. He never asked the right questions. That night at Canoe, he decided to make his contempt everyone else's entertainment. It was the worst mistake of his professional life. You know the type. The kind who shakes your hand at Christmas dinner and asks twice what it is you do exactly because the first answer didn't impress him enough. The kind who talks about billing hours and equity stakes the way other men talk about their kids. Brendan Haley was that type with a law degree, a Rosedale address, and a jaw that always looked like it was waiting to be photographed. If you've ever been written off because of how you look or what you drive, this one's for you. Stay with me. My daughter Claire married Brendan 4 years ago at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Beautiful day. I paid for a significant portion of it, quietly, through Claire, because I knew how Brendan would interpret money coming from a handyman. He would have found a way to make it feel like charity. I let him think his parents covered the difference. His mother, a retired school board trustee from Burlington, never corrected the impression. She had kind eyes and didn't ask too many questions. I liked her for that. The first time Brendan dismissed me was the week after the wedding. We were at Sunday dinner at their new condo in Liberty Village, a place I could have purchased outright, though I'll come back to that. Claire had cooked her mother's roast chicken recipe. Brendan was talking about a file he was working on, something involving a commercial lease dispute in Mississauga, and he turned to me and said, "You probably know a few landlords, right? Guys you do work for?" He wasn't trying to include me in the conversation. He was filing me. I said I knew a few people, yes. He nodded the way you nod at something that doesn't require a follow-up and turned back to his wine. Claire caught my eye across the table. I gave her nothing to worry about. I'd spent 3 decades giving nothing away to people far more dangerous than a junior partner at a Bay Street firm. The second time was harder. It was the spring, his firm's annual client event at the Albany Club on King Street. Black tie. Claire had asked me to come, said it would mean a lot to her, so I rented a suit, on purpose, from Moores on Bloor. I could have worn better. I chose not to. Brendan was working the room the way he always did, orbiting power like it was a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. I was standing near the bar with a sparkling water when he brought over a senior partner, a man named Gallagher, silver-haired and clearly used to having the best version of everyone presented to him. "This is Claire's dad," Brendan said. "He runs a home repair business, plumbing, electrical, that kind of thing. Very skilled with his hands." He said it with exactly the warmth you'd use to compliment a golden retriever. Gallagher shook my hand. Firm grip, good eye contact. The man had decent instincts. "What part of the city?" he asked. "East End mostly," I said. "Little bit, everywhere." "My father was an electrician," Gallagher said. "Honest work." Brendan smiled tightly. The conversation moved on. But I saw him lean toward Claire later, near the coat check, and I am good at reading lips. "He doesn't have to come to everything," he said. "People ask questions." Claire didn't tell me that. She told me the next morning when she called to thank me for coming, and I could hear in her voice that she hadn't slept. "He's under a lot of pressure with the partnership track," she said. "I know," I said. "He doesn't mean anything by it. I know that, too. I did not know that, but she needed me to say it. The third time was 6 weeks before the partner announcement dinner. Claire and Brendan had come to my place in the beach, a modest semi I've owned since 1998, kept deliberately unremarkable, for Thanksgiving. My neighbor Paulette brought over a pie. I had the game on. Normal Sunday. Brendan was on his second scotch when he started talking about a case he'd heard about. An organized crime prosecution out of Hamilton, Hell's Angels adjacent, money moving through shell companies. He was animated, genuinely excited, the way lawyers get when the material is bigger than they usually see. The RCMP's been after this network for years, he said. No one can get close. These guys are sophisticated. They're patient, I said. That's not the same as sophisticated. Brendan looked at me over his glass. What's the difference? Sophisticated means they've thought through every contingency. Patient just means they've decided they can wait longer than you can. Very different problem to solve. He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed. That's a pretty nuanced take for a guy who fixes sump pumps. My son-in-law smiled like he'd made a joke. Claire went very still. Paulette, who was in the kitchen and has known me for 11 years, made a small sound I recognized as her deciding not to say anything. I went back to the game. What Brendan didn't know, what I couldn't tell him, was that I'd spent 8 years working alongside RCMP and OPP joint task forces on exactly that kind of network. I'd sat in vehicles outside Hamilton warehouses for 16-hour stretches. I'd had conversations with people who would end a man's life over a perceived slight, and I'd done it while wearing a wire the size of a watch battery, eating a Tim Hortons sandwich, pretending I was a buyer from Sault Ste. Marie. My cover identity for most of my career was a traveling contractor. Handyman, small renovations, the kind of guy who drives between mid-sized Ontario cities without it seeming strange. It was chosen for me. It fit well enough that when I retired and actually needed something to do with my hands, I kept doing it. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I fixed things for people in my neighborhood. I charge less than I should. I like the work. But there are things in my house that don't belong to a handyman. An encrypted phone in the drawer of my bedside table, a file box in the basement with a service medal and a commendation letter on Department of Justice, letterhead, a photograph of me shaking hands with a man whose name I'm still not allowed to say in a context that can be recorded. Brendan had been in my house a dozen times. He never asked about any of it. He never asked because he'd already decided what I was. That's the thing about people who lead with credentials. They stop gathering information once they think they have enough. The partner announcement dinner was a Friday night in October at Canoe on the 54th floor of the TD Tower. Toronto spread out below us, all lit up, Lake Ontario going dark at the edge of the city. 60 guests. Claire was in a green dress that made her look like her mother. I wore my own suit this time. Nothing flashy, but mine. Brendan's parents were there. His father, a retired insurance executive from Oakville, shook my hand correctly and asked about the Leafs. His mother asked about my neighborhood and seemed genuinely interested. I liked them. I want to be clear about that. The problem was never his family. The problem was Brendan and what Brendan became when he had an audience. His senior partner Gallagher was there with his wife. 2 federal ministers I recognized. One of them had, at a different time in my life, been briefed in a room I was also in, though he would not have known my name. A Queen's Counsel I'd seen quoted in files. A judge from the Ontario Superior Court, whom I had never met, but whose career had been shaped by prosecutions that my work had made possible, though that is not a connection anyone in the room would have drawn. I found a seat near the window and had a glass of Chardonnay and watched the city. The trouble started the way it usually does, with a toast. Gallagher spoke first, then the managing partner, then a few of Brendan's colleagues. Then Brendan stood up. He was good on his feet, I'll give him that. He had the room comfortable. A few genuine laughs, appropriate humility about the hard work of people around him. He thanked Claire, he thanked his parents, and then something shifted. I've seen it before, in rooms very different from this one. The moment when a person who has been performing confidence starts to believe it. When the performance and the person collapse into each other, and they do something they've been wanting to do for a long time because the room finally feels safe enough. "I want to say something about family," Brendan said, and I felt Claire straighten slightly beside me. "Because you can't get to a night like this without the people who shaped you. My parents taught me what ambition looks like. My wife taught me what loyalty looks like." He paused, and the pause was deliberate. "And my father-in-law," another pause. "The smile of a man who thinks he's about to be charming. Well, Ray taught me that there's dignity in every kind of work. He keeps things running. Fixed you's what's broken. That's its own kind of contribution, and I think we should acknowledge it." Polite applause from people who weren't sure what they were applauding. I took a sip of my wine, but Brendan wasn't finished. He was reading the room, seeing that it had landed somewhere between warm and awkward, and he pushed. He always pushed. In all seriousness, though, and I say this with respect, some of us are built to build the framework, and some of us are built to maintain it. Ray's been maintaining things his whole career, and there is honor in that. There really is. The table was quiet. Gallagher's wife looked at her husband. Claire's hand found my arm under the table. I set down my glass. "May I?" I said, and stood up before the answer came. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something unexpected is about to happen. "To my son-in-law," I said, lifting my water glass, "who has spent 4 years learning what I do. I hope the next 4 are more illuminating." I sat down. Brendan laughed, but it didn't land right. Too sharp. A few people smiled at me in a way that suggested they'd enjoyed it more than they were going to show. Later, near the dessert table, he found me. "That was a bit pointed, Ray. You opened the door. I was being complimentary. You were being careful. There's a difference." He studied me. I've been studied by professionals. It didn't land. "Claire tells me you were in some kind of government work before the trades," he said. "Municipal inspection or something?" "Something like that. Because I've always wondered why a man with your," he searched for the word, "steadiness, would spend his time fixing gutters." "Because I'm good at it," I said, "and I choose to be." He nodded slowly, the way he had at that first Sunday dinner, filing me again, but less certain of the drawer. I went back to the window. The city looked the same as it always does from up high, organized, indifferent, full of things happening below the surface. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Not the regular one, the other one. I felt it vibrate in my jacket pocket and excused myself from the table. Claire gave me a look. I shook my head slightly. "Not now, not here," and stepped into the hallway near the coat check. Brooks. I hadn't used my operational surname in 8 months. Ray. "It's Heather. I'm sorry to do this on a Friday. Heather Doyle, Deputy Director of Operations, CSIS. We'd worked together on 3 files over 15 years, most recently the network penetration assessment I consulted on in February. Go ahead. The Meridian file has moved faster than projected. The director wants your read on the communication intercepts before we brief the minister Monday morning. We need you in the building tomorrow, 9 a.m. We can send a car tonight if it helps. Tomorrow morning is fine. I'll drive myself." "Thank you, Ray. Genuinely." I hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. The jazz quartet had started up again. I could hear Brendan's laugh from inside the room, the big one he used when partners were listening. I went back in. I sat down. I picked up my wine, and then Brendan stood up again. He'd had another whiskey. I could see it in the way he was holding himself, the way his gestures had gotten slightly too large. He wasn't sloppy. He was emboldened. "One more thing," he said, and I heard Claire say his name, quietly, once. He didn't hear it, or didn't listen. I want to clear something up because I noticed something when my father-in-law stepped out just now, and I realize I might have let something go unsaid all night. The room had gone uncertain. People could feel the edge in him. There's been a bit of mystery around Ray. The vague answers, the official-looking mail he's always getting, the phone calls he steps away for. My wife thinks I don't notice things, but I'm a lawyer. I notice. He smiled at his own joke. And I'll be honest, I've spent 4 years wondering if Claire's father is exactly what he says he is. A retired tradesman who fixes things. The table was entirely still. So Ray. He turned to look at me directly, with 60 people watching. I think tonight's the night for honesty. What is it that you actually do, or did? Because I don't think it's gutters. Claire's hand was flat on the table. I looked at my son-in-law for a long moment. I looked at the room, at Gallagher, who was watching with an expression I couldn't quite read, at the minister near the window, who had gone completely still, at Judge Arsenault from the Superior Court, who had set down his fork. "You really want to do this here," I said, "in front of everyone. I think we've earned some honesty, yes." "All right." I reached into my jacket. I took out the phone. I set it on the table. "That call I just stepped out for," I said. "That was the Deputy Director of Operations at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. She's sending a car to my house tonight, and I told her I'd rather drive myself in the morning." I paused. "I said I had family obligations." Brendan stared at the phone. "CSIS," he said. "You're saying you work for CSIS?" "Worked. 31 years. I retired 5 years ago, but they still call." I looked around the table. Apparently they always call. "That's..." He laughed, but it was a different laugh now. Smaller. "That's not possible. You fix things. You drive a truck with rust on it." "I drove that truck for 11 years undercover. It's a good truck. I kept it." I reached back into my jacket pocket and took out my credentials wallet. Old habit. I'd carried it since retirement without thinking much about it. I set it on the table beside the phone. The CSIS service medal was at home in the basement. But the wallet had enough. Gallagher leaned forward. The minister had stood up from his chair, just slightly. "The Meridian file she mentioned," I said, "is a foreign interference operation running through 3 provinces. I can't say more than that in a room that hasn't been cleared. But that's the kind of thing they call me about." Judge Arsenault spoke. Bremen Brooks. He said it like he was placing something. "The Heartland prosecution, 2009. I can't confirm case names. The Principal Witness Protection Coordination. That was you." I said nothing, which was its own answer. Arsenault looked at Brendan. "Young man, the case your firm cited in your partnership announcement, the offshore trust prosecution that set the precedent for your entire commercial fraud practice, the intelligence that cracked that network open, came from a 12-year undercover operation." He paused. "I presided over the trial. I read every page of the source documentation. I never knew the operative's name. We called him the plumber in the court documents." He looked back at me. "Because that was his cover. The room was silent except for the jazz quartet, which had no idea." Brendan sat down. Not gradually. His knees went and he sat down. "The truck," he said. "The neighborhood." "The doc shows it," I said. "After 31 years of being someone else in a city that wasn't mine, eating in diners at 2 in the morning, watching people I'd grown to care about get moved into protection. I wanted to go home to the beach and fix things that were actually broken and know who my neighbors were." I looked at Claire. "I wanted to be your father in a way I'd never quite managed to be while I was working. That's all." Claire's eyes were wet. She didn't look away. "The rust on the truck," she said softly, "was there when I bought it. I liked it. Decided it suited me." Gallagher cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, I want to apologize on behalf of this firm for anything." "There's nothing to apologize for," I said. I didn't correct the impression. That's on me. The minister stepped around the table and shook my hand. I won't use his name here. He knew what he was shaking my hand for, and I knew he knew, and that was enough. The aftermath was not dramatic in the way these things are in films. There was no shouting, no scene. There was the quiet redistribution of how people in that room held themselves around Brendan for the rest of the evening, which is a more Canadian form of consequence. Subtle, thorough, and permanent. By the following Monday, Gallagher had called Claire to ask, carefully, whether there were any concerns she wanted to raise about the firm's culture. 3 partners had separately mentioned the speech to the managing partner over the weekend. No formal action, just a file, beginning. Brendan's path to senior partnership, which had been, by all accounts, well paved, developed complications. A file he'd been lead on was quietly redistributed to a colleague who had stronger relationships with the federal regulatory contacts. He was not told this directly. He figured it out over 6 weeks of being CE'd on emails he used to originate. His father called me one Saturday morning. Retired insurance man Oakville. Good instincts? Ray, he said, I owe you an apology I probably should have made years ago. My wife and I knew he was doing this. We told ourselves it was ambition. It was ambition, I said. Ambition with bad manners. It's common. Will Claire be all right? I told him that was her question to answer, not mine. She came to the beach on a Wednesday, early November, and sat in the kitchen while I made tea. Outside, the lake was going gray-green, the way it does in autumn. He keeps saying you should have told him, she said, that none of this would have happened if you'd been up front. What do you say? She looked at her hands around the mug. I say he had 4 years of evidence that you were worth knowing as you were. He decided to skip it. I didn't answer because she didn't need me to. I'm staying with him, she said, and I heard the weight in it, the decision that had been made over many sleepless nights. But things are going to be different. He's agreed to counseling. He knows what it will cost him if he doesn't follow through. That sounds right. Are you disappointed that I'm not leaving? I thought about her mother, who had stayed through years of my absences and half-truths and encrypted phone calls, and had loved me anyway, with a kind of furious, open-eyed loyalty that I will never feel I fully deserved. The day your mother decided to stay with me, I said, was the best decision anyone's ever made on my behalf. I'm not going to tell you what to do with yours. She cried then, quietly, the way she's cried since she was a child, without fuss, like it was a thing that needed doing and she was going to get it done. I drove to CSIS the next morning, parked in the visitor lot, which still felt strange after 31 years of the staff entrance. Heather met me in the lobby. She looked tired. The Meridian file was worse than they'd briefed me. I spent 4 hours going through intercepts, made 3 recommendations, signed a confidentiality extension, and was back in the beach by 3. Stopped at the hardware store on Queen Street for weather stripping. Paulette's back door had been drafty for 2 weeks, and I'd promised to fix it Thursday. The regular phone rang as I was pulling into my street. Brendan. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Ray. He sounded like a man who had spent 3 weeks preparing a sentence and was still not sure it was right. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind I would write in a legal letter. A real one. I let the silence sit for a moment. Go ahead, I said. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, I made you smaller than you were because it made me feel bigger than I am. I knew what I was doing. I thought I could get away with it because of what I thought you were. I listened. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I'm not sure it can be fixed, but I needed you to know I understand what I did. Outside, the maples on my street had lost most of their leaves. The neighbor's kid was kicking through a pile of them near the sidewalk, just kicking for the satisfaction of it, the way kids do. It can't be fixed in a phone call, I said. But this is a reasonable place to start. We didn't talk long. I told him I'd see him at Christmas. if Claire decided she wanted that. He said he hoped she would. I went inside and put the kettle on. 31 years. Surveillance vehicles and dead drops and border crossings with papers that said someone else's name. Safe houses in Sudbury and a bad winter in Thunder Bay I don't talk about. Coming home to my daughter's school, plays with security clearances in my jacket pocket, and a cover story ready if anyone asked too many questions. I chose the truck. I chose the neighborhood. I chose the rust. Because at the end of it, what I wanted was the most unclassified version of myself that I could find. A man who knew where things were broken and had the patience to fix them. A man my daughter could call on a Tuesday just because she wanted to talk. The encrypted phone is still in the drawer. It still rings every few months when something moves that they need a read on. I don't think it'll ever stop completely. But Tuesday mornings I drive the truck down to the Beach Hardware, pick up whatever's needed, and go fix something for someone who's glad to have it fixed. No cover story. No operational objective, just the work and the people it's for and the simple, unbeatable satisfaction of leaving something better than you found it. That's enough. That's always been enough. I still think about the moment Brendan sat down. Not the look on his face, though I won't pretend I didn't notice it, but the particular silence that followed. 60 people in a room with a view of the whole city, and not one of them made a sound. That kind of silence is earned. It doesn't happen by accident. What Brendan never understood was that everything he thought made him superior was the surface of things. The firm, the address, the billing rate, the way he carried himself into rooms, those were signals, and he'd learned to read them, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped looking for anything underneath. That's not a character flaw you're born with. It's one you build, slowly, by only rewarding yourself for the visible things. He became very good at measuring. He just measured wrong. I don't say that with bitterness. I spent 31 years working with people who made those same calculations and paid far heavier prices for them. The difference between a good operative and a compromised one is usually not intelligence. It's honesty. The willingness to look at a situation as it actually is, not as you need it to be. Brendan was a smart man who had quietly decided that his version of the world was complete. That's a dangerous thing to decide. What I've come to believe, and this took me longer than I'd like to admit, is that the way you treat someone when you think they can't hurt you is the truest possible measure of who you are. Not the big moments, not the files you win, not the partnerships you make, the small ones, the Sunday dinners, the coat check conversations, the toasts you give when the whiskey has made you feel safe. That's where character actually lives. Claire understood that. She understood it, I think. Before that night at Canoe, she'd been watching Brendan and watching me for 4 years, and she knew something I wouldn't have admitted out loud, which was that staying quiet had its own cost. That it wasn't just patience. It was a choice I made, and choices have weight, and sometimes the people who love you carry some of that weight without being asked. She deserved better than that from me, and I've told her so since. The work I did for 31 years asked me to be someone else entirely, for stretches of time that would have broken people who hadn't decided, firmly and early, what they actually stood for. What kept me intact, I mean this plainly, not as a speech, was that I always knew the difference between the cover and the person underneath it. I never confused them. I never let the performance become the truth. That's the only thing I'd call wisdom in any of it. The truck is still in the driveway, still has the rust. I drove it to the hardware store on Tuesday and picked up weather stripping for Paulette's back door. And on the way home, I stopped for a coffee and sat in the parking lot and watched the lake for a few minutes. Because October in Toronto is short and I've learned not to waste it. The encrypted phone rang that afternoon. I let it go to message. Heather would understand. Some things can wait until morning.